This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. It began with a discovery in the summer of 1980. On a chilly July morning near Eklutna Lake, about an hour outside of Anchorage, Alaska, a crew of electrical workers made a gruesome find. Buried in a shallow grave beneath power lines was the partially scavenged body of a young woman. Animals had gotten to her remains, and only a skeleton and a few tattered clothes and personal items were left. No name, no identification, just a mystery. Investigators would call her Eklutna Annie, after the area in which she was found. Who was this woman? The autopsy indicated she had been dead for several months, likely killed by a stab wound to the back. She was small in stature, perhaps 5 feet tall, and possibly in her late teens or early 20s. When Eklutna Annie was unearthed, she wore jeans, a knit sweater, and knee-high red boots along with some jewelry. A bracelet with turquoise stones, a shell necklace, and a Timex watch. These belongings hinted at a life that someone, somewhere, might remember. But despite these clues, the police could not match her to any missing persons report. It was as if she never existed in the official record. Detectives suspected she wasn't local. Maybe she had drifted up to Alaska from Washington or California, drawn by the promise of adventure or money in the booming frontier town. But investigators knew at least one thing about this young woman. She had not died by accident. Eklutna Annie was a murder victim, and whoever killed her had gotten away with it. In fact, police would eventually learn that she was the first known victim of a prolific predator, though in 1980 that truth was only beginning to surface. At the time, all investigators had was a cold trail and a nameless girl in an unmarked grave. Authorities in Anchorage had little to go on, and perhaps in another place the mystery might have ended there. But Anchorage, Alaska in 1980 had many dark secrets hidden just beneath its surface, and Eklutna Annie was only the beginning. This is the story of the Butcher Baker. Part 1. The Less Dead. To understand what was happening, one has to picture Anchorage at the dawn of the 1980s. Just a few years earlier, the construction of the 800-mile Trans-Alaska oil pipeline had transformed this once sleepy city almost overnight. Oil money flooded in, jobs were plentiful, and with them came a flood of people chasing fortune. Roughnecks, drifters, adventurers, and opportunists of all kinds. As one report later described, Anchorage became a boomtown of oilmen, construction workers, and a vice economy of illegal drugs and sex. People poured in from the lower 48, many leaving behind their past. It was a burgeoning town in the last frontier, settled by people without roots or community ties. People who, if they disappeared, would hardly be missed. During the pipeline boom, the city's nightlife exploded. Downtown Anchorage in the late 1970s and early 1980s was awash with neon-lit bars, strip clubs like the Wild Cherry and the Good Times, and a steady supply of sex workers who catered to the workers flush with cash. The influx also brought out pimps, drug dealers, and con artists, all looking to separate those well-paid laborers from their money. It was a bit of a heady, anything-goes atmosphere, but also a dangerous one. One article noted years later, workers and drug dealers and dancers came and went, many with few ties to the state, and no one to notice if they went missing. Disappearances became commonplace, easily written off as someone moving on to the next boomtown, or returning home. For the police in Anchorage, this transient population posed a bit of a nightmare. People arrived and left without a trace. Friends and acquaintances might not even know someone's real name, let alone notice if they vanished. And there was a pervasive misogyny and indifference toward the women working the streets and the clubs. Many in law enforcement did not hide their bias that these street girls were troublemakers or unreliable. In this mix, a sinister pattern could hide in plain sight. As Alaska State Trooper Glenn Flota later observed, the emerging predator in Anchorage quickly learned that strippers and prostitutes were harder to track and less likely to be missed. In other words, the very boom that brought the city wealth also created the perfect conditions for a serial killer to operate undetected. In the months around the discovery of Eklutna Annie in mid-1980, a quiet pattern had already begun forming. Women, mostly dancers, some sex workers, were vanishing from Anchorage at an alarming rate. One officer with the APD, Detective Maxine Farrell, began keeping an informal list of these missing women. She sensed something was wrong. She later recalled, dancers were going missing, and they weren't coming back. By late 1981, Detective Farrell had noted at least half a dozen disappearances that looked eerily similar. These were young women that worked in the clubs along Anchorage's Tenderloin district. Women like Roxanne Eastland, 24 years old, who vanished after leaving the Budget Motel on June 28, 1980. Or Lisa Futrell, 41 years old, who never returned home after her shift at a nightclub on September 7th. Or Susie Luna, 23, last seen at a diner parking lot in May 1982, lured by a man offering $300 for an hour of company. One after another, these women simply disappeared without a trace. There were no bodies found, at least not at first. Anchorage police weren't quick to sound any alarm. Given the transient nature of the victims, officers often assumed that the missing women had left town voluntarily, or simply got lost in the churn of the oil boom. There was also a distinct lack of urgency due to who these victims were. They were young, often marginalized women, dancers, runaways, sex workers. And the hard truth is that their absence did not ring the same alarm bells within the department as a missing housewife or a tourist might have. As one journalist later put it, when Anchorage's sex workers began disappearing in the late 1970s, it went unnoticed. This indifference was exactly what the killer counted on. He targeted those he thought nobody would chase. And for a while, he was absolutely right. Nobody in authority connected the dots. Not yet. But the disappearances did begin to worry a few on the inside. Along with Detective Maxine Farrell at Anchorage PD, the Alaska State Troopers were also paying attention, especially once bodies, not just missing persons reports, started to turn up. Eklutna Annie was the first to be found in July 1980, but just a few weeks after that, there was another. The second body belonged to Joanna Messina, a 24-year-old who had come north chasing her own Alaskan dream. Joanna's story was in many ways typical of those drawn to the last frontier. She had grown up far away, trained as a nurse, married young, but by 1980 she was restless and yearning for something more. According to Alaska State Trooper Walter Gilmore, who later pieced together her background, Messina had left her husband in New York and wandered west, leaving her family behind without much of a goodbye. With her trusty German Shepherd, she had hitched her way to Alaska, ostensibly to find a job in a cannery. Joanna arrived in the port town of Seward with little money and big hopes. Broke and hungry, she found lodging in a run-down rooming house and kept to herself, reading books to pass the time. She was proud and independent, perhaps stubbornly so. To acquaintances, Joanna acted as if the world owed her something after the hard turns her life had taken. Her only constant companion was her German Shepherd, who rarely left her side and fiercely protected her. But in the early summer months of 1980, Joanna Messina vanished. She was last seen around May 19th, reportedly going out to dinner with a man in Seward. When she never returned, a friend reported her missing. Given Joanna's somewhat nomadic lifestyle, authorities did not immediately treat her case as foul play. But on July 8th, just a couple of months later, the grim truth surfaced. Joanna's badly decomposed body was found in a gravel pit near the Snow River, just outside of Seward. Wildlife had scavenged her remains, making the cause of death difficult to determine at the scene. Investigators did note an odd detail though. There was no sign of Joanna's missing dog. Locals who knew her remarked with surprise that no one could imagine her going anywhere without her beloved German Shepherd. Walter Gilmore later wrote, "Most of the people who had known her dog wondered how anyone would be able to kill her while the dog was in the vicinity. No dog was ever found near her body, however." That chilling detail suggested that whoever had killed Joanna likely disposed of her dog as well, perhaps to eliminate the only witness or protector that she had. It would be years before the full story of Joanna Messina's death came to light. Later on, her killer admitted what had happened. He had taken Joanna and her dog to a remote spot by the river under the pretense of a casual encounter. When he tried to force herself on her, Joanna fought back, and he bludgeoned her and then shot her twice, shooting her dog once with a .22 caliber handgun. He dumped Joanna's body in the gravel pit, tossed her belongings into the woods, and sank the gun into the river. In one cruel stroke, Joanna's quest for a new life in Alaska ended, her body left for the bears and her loyal dog gone without a trace. At the time of Joanna's murder in 1980, police did not immediately connect it with Eklutna Annie's case. The two crime scenes were over 120 miles apart, one near Anchorage, the other near Seward, and different police agencies were involved. APD handled Eklutna Annie. Alaska State Troopers on the Kenai Peninsula dealt with Joanna's death. But one person had taken note of the similarities. Glenn Flota, a young investigator with the Alaska State Troopers who had a keen eye for patterns. By 1982, Flota had become part of a team quietly investigating what they now suspected were serial killings. The first was Eklutna Annie. The second was Joanna Messina, and soon there would be a third. Anchorage's red light district in the early 1980s was a realm of neon lights, smoky bars, and young women trying to make a living by dancing or through sex work. Sherry Morrow was one of those women. At 23, Sherry was described by friends as kind and hardworking, a topless dancer at the Wild Cherry who dreamed of something better. In November 1981, she thought that she might have found an opportunity. She excitedly told a close girlfriend that she had a photo shoot lined up with a man who approached her at the club. He claimed to be a photographer willing to pay $300 for a few hours taking nude pictures. The plan was to meet him the next day, November 17th, at noon, at a diner called Alice's 210 Cafe in downtown Anchorage. It sounded a little odd, but $300, especially in 1981, was hard to pass up. Sherry's boyfriend certainly did not object. He was used to her dancing gigs and the unusual offers that sometimes came her way. So on the night of November 16th, Sherry stayed over at her girlfriend's house, preparing for the meeting the next day. She left for the meeting on the 17th, hopeful and perhaps a bit nervous. That was sadly the last time any of Sherry's friends saw her alive. When she did not return or contact anyone, her boyfriend reported her missing on November 23rd, nearly a week later. In the context of early 1980s Anchorage, Sherry Morrow's disappearance initially drew little more than a routine missing persons investigation. But again, Detective Maxine Farrell at APD took note. Here was yet another dancer gone. Sherry's case had a concrete lead, the mysterious photographer at Alice's 210 Cafe, yet that lead was as good as a ghost. No one knew the man's name or where he planned to take her. Months passed with no sign of Sherry. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer of 1982. Sherry's friends feared the worst, but without a body or a witness, police had no proof that a crime had even occurred. Maybe Sherry had just left. That belief changed on September 12, 1982, nearly an entire year later. On that day, by pure chance, two off-duty Anchorage police officers were out on a riverboat trip near the Knik River, about 25 miles north of Anchorage. They navigated to a gravel sandbar on the river's north shore, a spot so remote it was accessible only by boat, off-road vehicle, or small plane. As these off-duty cops made camp for the night, one of them stumbled upon what looked like a shallow grave. In the first light of dawn the next day, they investigated and realized it indeed was a gravesite, with human remains. They reported their find to the Alaska State Troopers post in Palmer, the jurisdiction covering that wilderness area. Troopers arrived and carefully exhumed the site. There, lying in a crude grave on the Knik River bank, they found the body of a young woman. She was fully clothed, jeans, sweater, jacket. Oddly, there were no bullet holes in her clothing, yet the remains revealed bullet wounds in her back. Clutched around her were small items later identified as cheap jewelry. The scene yielded a critical piece of evidence: spent shell casings from a rifle. Ballistics would soon reveal that they were from a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 hunting rifle, a powerful firearm, far more potent than any handgun. Dental records would later confirm what Detective Farrell had already suspected. The body was Sherry Morrow, missing for nearly an entire year. The autopsy determined that Sherry had been shot 3 times in the back. Given the lack of holes in her clothing, investigators theorized a horrifying detail. Sherry had likely been naked when shot, then redressed before burial. This suggested a killer that was oddly ritualistic. perhaps someone who took the time to cover his atrocities after the fact. For law enforcement, the discovery of Sherry Morrow's body was a bit of a turning point. The pattern that Detective Maxine Farrell worried about was now confirmed in the most brutal way. Anchorage, it seemed, had a serial killer on its hands. The unsolved disappearances were no longer being treated as likely runaways or one-offs. They were undoubtedly part of a connected series of murders. Alaska State Troopers, with jurisdiction over the Knik River area, took lead on this homicide investigation, and Detective Glenn Flota dove in with resolve. He began to see the connections between Eklutna Annie, Joanna Messina, and Sherry Morrow, and suspected that they were all the work of one offender. By late 1982, Flota was openly telling his colleagues that Anchorage had a serial predator. He believed that all three women had been murdered by the same perpetrator, and he was now determined to catch him. More after the break. Even as investigators finally recognized the serial nature of this threat, the killer wasn't finished. In the spring of 1983, another young woman went missing under strikingly familiar circumstances. Paula Golding was 30 years old, an aspiring model and dancer who, like many others, had come to Anchorage looking for opportunity. In late April, Paula confided to a friend that she had been offered $300 for a photo shoot by a man who said he was a professional photographer, the same ruse that had lured Sherry Morrow. On April 25th, Paula agreed to meet this photographer. After that, she was never heard from again. Friends reported Paula missing, but as with the others, the case languished without leads. Unbeknownst to them, Paula had suffered a fate chillingly similar to Sherry Morrow's. It would later be revealed that the man who took Paula had flown her in a small plane to a secluded stretch of wilderness by the Knik River. When he tried to assault her, Paula fought back and managed to break free for a moment, a burst of courage that might have cost her her life. The killer raised a Ruger Mini-14 rifle and shot Paula in the back as she fled, inflicting a mortal wound. Like Sherry, Paula was apparently not clothed when she was shot. Her killer likely dressed her afterward, before hastily burying her in a shallow grave by the riverbank. Through the frantic spring and early summer of 1983, Trooper Flota and his team continued to quietly compile evidence on the existing cases. They now had 3 victims' bodies, Eklutna Annie, Joanna Messina, and Sherry Morrow, along with several others that had been reported missing. Alaska State Troopers reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for a criminal profile of the likely perpetrator. Famed profiler John Douglas analyzed the details of the known murders and offered a portrait of the killer. He believed that the offender would be an experienced hunter, comfortable in the Alaskan backcountry where the bodies were found. He would likely have low self-esteem and a history of being rejected by women, which might fuel a need to dominate and degrade his victims. Douglas also suggested that the killer probably kept souvenirs, trophies from his victims like jewelry, as a way to relive the crime. And intriguingly, John Douglas added one more detail to his profile. He believed that the assailant might have a stutter. This was an unusually specific trait, but it stemmed from the idea that someone with a speech impediment and low self-esteem could harbor deep resentments, possibly triggered by humiliations in his past. The profile gave Glenn Flota a clear direction. He began cross-referencing those traits against a list of potential suspects. Men in the Anchorage area that had hunting experience, that possibly had a plane, since remote sites were often accessible only by aircraft, and any history of violence or sexual assault. As you can imagine, at the time this wasn't a very long list, but one name jumped out almost immediately: Robert, or Bob, Hansen. Robert Hansen was, on the surface, the kind of ordinary citizen that drew little suspicion. He was 44 years old in 1983, a self-employed baker who owned a little bakery shop in downtown Anchorage. Hansen was a wiry, unassuming man who wore thick glasses and spoke in a quiet voice. In fact, he had a lifelong stutter and acne-scarred skin that had made him painfully shy since boyhood. To those that knew him casually, Bob Hansen was a mild-mannered family man, married with 2 children, and a respected small business owner. Cops from the neighborhood would often stop into Hansen's bakery for coffee and donuts, exchanging pleasantries with the friendly owner behind the counter. As prosecutor Frank Rothschild later noted, the cops went there for coffee and donuts all the time. No one imagined that this meek baker could be the monster stalking Anchorage. But Glenn Flota knew that Hansen ticked many of the profiler's boxes. Hansen was an avid hunter, known for stalking sheep and bear in the Alaskan wilderness and boasting of trophy kills. He even owned his own small airplane, a Super Cub that he kept at Merrill Field, which gave him the ability to fly into the remote bush at will. And Hansen did have a criminal record that hinted at violence beneath the surface. Back in 1971, he had been arrested twice, once for abducting a housewife at gunpoint, and again for raping a sex worker, though through plea deals he managed to avoid significant jail time for both. To Glenn Flota, Hansen was a glaring red flag in an otherwise small pool of suspects. Still, Anchorage PD wasn't entirely convinced at first. Hansen had what appeared to be a solid alibi for at least one incident under investigation, and he had a loyal friend willing to vouch for him. In one case, Hansen shrugged off suspicion by claiming a woman accusing him was just angry he would not pay her extortion demands, and a friend of his named John Heading backed up his story. This good guy image, combined with the lack of direct evidence, kept Hansen afloat as a free man. By the summer of 1983, Flota had Robert Hansen in his sights, but he needed proof, something that could break the case open. As fate would later have it, that proof would not come from forensic analysis or a stroke of investigative genius, but from a brave 17-year-old who crossed paths with Robert Hansen one terrifying night. The name she's known by is Cindy Paulson, and her courage would finally expose the killer lurking in Anchorage. Cindy Paulson was just 17 years old, but she had already lived a very hard life. She was working the streets of Anchorage in June 1983, a tall, blue-eyed teenager who danced in clubs and sometimes turned tricks to get by. In the early pre-dawn hours of June 13, 1983, Cindy stood under the orange glow of a streetlight on 4th Avenue, looking for a client. That's when a balding, bespectacled man in a car pulled up to her. He seemed a bit awkward, but harmless enough. He offered Cindy $200 for oral sex, a generous sum for what would probably be a quick encounter. Needing the money, Cindy agreed and got into the passenger seat of the car. From the moment she shut the car door behind her, Cindy sensed something was off. The man's demeanor shifted. The friendly veneer dropped. He did not drive toward the typical spots in downtown where such transactions might occur. Instead, he headed toward a more isolated part of town. Before Cindy could protest, the stranger reached under a seat and produced a handgun, swiftly gripping her by the wrist. She later recalled, "And he had cuffed one of my hands and I was trying to get loose and he pulled out a gun." In a snap, a steel handcuff locked around her wrist. She thrashed and struggled, heart pounding, but within seconds her other wrist was manacled too. She later remembered, "I fought, but not a lot because I knew he would do something." Cindy was trapped. The man drove on, telling her to shut up and stay down. With one hand on the wheel and the other holding his gun to her side, he made it clear that any attempt to escape would be met with violence. Through the haze of panic, Cindy caught a few details of the car. It was a tan sedan. It was messy inside. She noticed maps and aviation manuals strewn about on the back seat, and an odd sweet smell, perhaps remnants of baked goods. The realization was dawning on her that she might have heard of this man or others like him. Anchorage's underground had whispered rumors for months now about a guy who preyed on dancers. Now here she was, living the nightmare firsthand. In the darkness, the abductor drove Cindy to a modest home on Muldoon, an East Anchorage neighborhood. Inside, the nightmare escalated. Cindy was chained by the neck in a basement den, tortured and sexually assaulted for hours. The man treated her like property. At one point, he tied a rope around her neck and secured it to a post next to a grimy old sofa. Exhausted and terrified, Cindy tried to humanize herself to him. She told him her name, lying that she had a young child at home, hoping to gain pity, begging him to let her go. She promised not to tell anyone what had happened, pleading, "All I want to do is go home." Her captor barely reacted except to snarl that if she cooperated, she wouldn't get hurt. Those words echoed the same false promise he had given others before, a promise he almost never kept. After he had his fill of violence, the man finally allowed Cindy a brief respite. He left her shackled by the neck to the coffee table while he went to sleep on the nearby couch, as if this were all in a night's work. Cindy lay there awake, trembling and studying everything around her. She knew details could save her if she ever got out alive. She noted the mounted hunting trophies on the wall, impressive animal heads labeled with engraved plaques. From one of them, she learned her captor's name. He had told her earlier that his name was Don, but etched on a trophy was the name Robert Hansen. She filed it away in her mind. She also noticed that there were heavy metal bars on the basement windows, and even a bullet hole in the linoleum floor, eerie markers that this was not the first time violence had ever occurred here. Near dawn, Robert Hansen stirred awake. Perhaps emboldened by Cindy's seeming compliance and his own fatigue, he decided to move on to the final phase of his horrific ritual. He came to Cindy and unlocked the chain from the table, keeping her cuffed, then dragged the petrified girl back out to his car. Hansen told Cindy that they were going to his remote cabin for a little trip. Cindy later recounted. He said that he had a plane over at Merrill Field and that we would go there, then he would take me to his cabin and bring me back. But Cindy knew in her gut what he really meant, later recalling, "I knew that I wasn't going to come back." She believed he intended to fly her out into the wilderness and kill her where no one would ever find her. At approximately 5 a.m. on June 13th, Robert Hansen drove Cindy Paulson, still handcuffed and shivering, to Merrill Field, the small municipal airport in Anchorage. The sky was early morning gray as they arrived at the quiet airfield. Hansen's private plane, a blue and white Piper Super Cub, sat waiting on the tarmac. He parked his car near his hangar and turned to his captive. With a low, dangerous tone, Hansen told Cindy to stay put in the car while he prepped the plane, or else he would not hesitate to shoot her. Then he stepped out and walked a short distance away, busying himself with fueling and loading the aircraft for takeoff. Cindy Paulson sat in the back seat, her heart hammering against her chest. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, but she was amazingly, miraculously alone for the first time since this entire ordeal began. Adrenaline surged as she realized this might be her only chance. Through the windshield, she could see Hansen's back turned as he tended to his plane. Summoning every ounce of courage, Cindy decided to run. She briefly scooted over, lunged into the driver's seat, and fumbled for the door handle. In one burst, she shoved the door open and bolted, barefoot and terrified, into the chilly Anchorage morning. Hansen heard the commotion and spun around to see his victim sprinting away. He shouted in rage and started to give chase, but Cindy, driven by pure terror, had a head start. She raced toward the lights of 6th Avenue, chains jangling from her wrist. Hansen halted, calculating that an out-and-out pursuit might draw unwanted attention. He watched in fury as Cindy flagged down a passing pickup truck and clambered into the arms of a stunned Good Samaritan. In that moment, the predator lost control of his prey, and a 17-year-old girl achieved what no one else had. She escaped the butcher baker. To be continued on the next episode of Unresolved.